It is approximately 1:15 p.m., the 7th of June 2025, and this is Book 4, The Circle and the Sword. Chapter 1, The Crown That Could Not Be Held. The hall was not built for dissent. Its stones remembered only obedience, carved under Priotheer's hand when the tree was young, when guardians still passed like comets overhead. But now, the light was different. The banners had been taken down. The flame in the center of the chamber was not the fire that had once paved way for oaths, but a brass lamp lit by clerks. There were no guardians here, only Priiotheer alone at the foot of the dais, and the men who once begged for his blessing now standing in judgment. You were called to guide us. Instead, you made us kneel before war. Your silence was not mercy, it was abdication. We buried thousands while you watched stars fall from your hands. Priotheer said nothing, not in defiance, not in shame, only the quiet that followed him since air fell and the spiral sealed. His hair was gray now. His eyes did not search the crowd. They gazed past them, as though the memory of the wall still hung in the air, thick and unmoving. Another speaker, younger, angrier, stepped forward. We built our cities on your promises, and you gave us riddles. You gave us guardians who died like mortals and left us nothing but fire and graves. The crowd murmured, not in rage, but resignation. He had no crown, he had never worn one, but the people needed to see something fall. Priiotheer moved. No proclamation, no defense, just one step. Down from the platform, where he had stood for decades, he passed the dais, then the lamp, and finally the crowd. His hands were open, empty. He did not look back, no guard followed him, no voice stopped him, only the hush, not reverent, not odd, just final. A child in the back whispered, "Is it over?" A mother answered without looking, "No, it's the beginning." The ink was still wet when the arguments began. The charter lay on the central stone, pressed and sealed with 30 hands. Scholars, warriors, recorders, and the uneasy inheritors of a broken world. The ink ran slightly in the corner from heat and oil. No one dared wipe it. Outside the chamber, the bells were ringing, not in celebration, but in finality. A monarchy had ended, not with war, not with fire, but with the man himself, walking away. Inside, the air was thick. No throne must rise again, said one voice, old, dry, sharp. Not of flesh, not of God, especially not of memory. Others murmured in assent, some nodded too quickly. Then let the Republic not be ruled, another voice followed, younger, but taught, but examined. Let power be earned, held only in trust, proven by trial. So they built the trials, measures of speech, memory, logic, and civic law. No inheritance, no anointing, only tests. They outlawed prophecy, they burned the genealogies, they removed the word king from every book that still dared to speak it. They said this was wisdom, they said it would protect the people, but the chamber remained cold, and no one noticed when the first page of the Republic's charter began to fade slightly, not in ink, but in tone. The words were clear but hollow, precise but brittle. A young clerk entered, young, sweating, eyes darting nervously across the room. He held the first stamped seal, 12 points, a perfect circle at the center. He didn't know what the symbol meant, only that it was clean, symmetrical, safe. What shall we name the center, he asked. No one answered, not at first. Then softly, we call it nothing. The silence after was not agreement, it was the kind of silence that doesn't echo. He waited until nightfall. The old corridors below the assembly halls had no guards now. They were kept locked by convention, not need. The doors no longer bore symbols. The brass had long since dulled. The Republic had moved its archives, its ceremonies, its light. These chambers remained. Not outlawed, just forgotten. He moved without torch or escort. His cloak was worn at the edges. His breath fogged faintly in the stale air. The deeper he walked, the more the quiet pressed around him. Not silence, pressure. The kind that settled into the ribs and made even strong men turn back. But he did not turn. The hall opened into a wide room, domed, cracked near the ceiling. The pillars still bore the faint geometry of an earlier era's masonry, though the inlays had been removed. Where once the guardians trained, now there was dust. Where once vows were spoken, now there were echoes with no names. In his hands, wrapped in coarse linen and bound in leather cords, was a single sword. Not ornate, no gems, no insignia, but its shape was unmistakable. It was long, longer than the standard issue from the city armories. Its pommel was dense and weighted slightly forward. It had never been sharpened to a soldier's edge. It had never been displayed in public. It was not built to kill, it was built to end judgment. The Arbiter. Not a title, not a relic, a final tool, a thing made for one moment and left in case the moment came again. He reached the end of the room, a square platform low to the ground. Most assumed it was a cistern or abandoned foundation. Even the archivist had stopped logging it after the third Codex revision of the Charter. It wasn't even on the current maps of the Senate's subterranean layout. At its center was a circular groove, iron, thin, inset with an ancient latch, dulled by breath and oil and time. He knelt, unwrapped the linen slowly, one fold at a time, not out of reverence, but memory. Every motion was exact, not ritual, just deeply remembered. The sword gleamed only slightly in the dark. Its metal drank the little light that drifted from the corridor, as if it knew it was not meant to be seen. He laid it in the grove. It didn't clink or scrape, it fit. With both hands he pressed down. The mechanism shifted. The ring folded inward. A silent vibration ran through the floor. There was a moment, not long, but unmistakable, where the very air seemed to hold its breath. As the sword was lowered into the ground, the arbiter laid to rest for now. Then the slab hissed. Once, low and final, not mechanical, not mystical, just closed. He remained kneeling a moment longer, hands on his knees, eyes forward. And then he rose. There was no proclamation, no witnesses, no seal. He turned, walked back into the dark corridor, and left the sword behind. Behind him, unseen, a faint line of vapor rose from the ring. Not luminous, not symbolic, just cold. Not a power waiting to be awakened, not a legacy waiting to be claimed. Only a tool, buried, waiting. The Senate convened 2 weeks after the abdication. They gathered not in the old throne hall, but in the East Chamber. Once a records annex, now a legislative floor. The columns had been stripped bare, the windows were unadorned, each bench was cut to equal length. There were no platforms, they spoke in rows, not ranks. The charter was read aloud, clause by clause, article by article, 48 minutes without interruption. The only decoration was a seal above the entryway, 12 points surrounding a blank circle. When it ended, there was no applause, just the sound of ink drying. Then came the first motion. The last order ruled by memory. This one shall be ruled by awareness. Agreement came quickly. To remain stable, the Republic must know what it replaced, but not venerate it. There must be a record. There must be indexing. The chamber passed the proposal without dissent. A new bureau was chartered before nightfall, the Office of Civic Records. Its function was declared to be the classification of non-institutional phenomena of pre-Republic origin. No reference was made to religion, none to prophecy, not even to kingship, just classification. The office received its first directive within a week. All mentions of previous monarchic figures were to be entered into the public archive under historical personae. Any surviving weapons, seals, or correspondence from the pre-Republic order were to be tagged and secured. No memorials were to be removed, but no new ones could be built. Existing ones could be relabeled with date and factual description only. The orders were not cruel, they were precise. Another motion followed. What of the soldiers, one senator asked, those who fought for the old order? The chamber paused. An answer emerged, measured and plain. They will not be prosecuted, they will not be celebrated, they will not be moved. Former officers were given new titles: surveyors, consultants, stability attachés. Their prior ranks were retired, their oaths were never mentioned. A single memo circulated privately among the upper offices. A clean slate does not begin by purging, it begins by diluting. 3 months later, the office issued its first index report. 14 known names removed from public festivals, 27 titles retired from civic curricula, 3 sites flagged for commemorative revision, 1 surviving document deemed symbolically unstable, archived, sealed, not destroyed. The report concluded the Republic inherits the future. The past shall remain unmodified, but unarmed. A clerk in the records division flagged a phrase on their first day of review. It came from a faded journal belonging to a former field captain. We weren't righteous, we were simply the last ones willing to stand. The phrase was passed to a senior officer for classification. He marked it Tier 2, militarized sentiment, not suitable for citation. The clerk asked if they should erase it. No, the officer replied, let it sit. No one will read Tier 2. They both nodded. The phrase was left intact. It would never be quoted again. The last banner came down on a warm morning with no ceremony. It had hung for decades from the southern tower of the central square, dark red, embroidered with the old seal of the crownless reign. Time had frayed its edges, the thread had dulled, and pigeons had made their home in its folds. No one looked at it in months. The worker tasked with removing it didn't know its meaning. He unhooked it with a pole, let it fall to the paving stones, and folded it loosely over one arm. Where should I take it, he asked. The overseer shrugged. Doesn't matter. They tossed it on a low stone platform near the fountain, the kind that used for market announcements and lost item boards. Someone placed a crate of discarded textiles next to it. It sat there for an hour, then 2, then longer. Children found it first. They played beside it, then on top of it. One boy draped it around his shoulders and declared himself king of the pigeons. Another crowned him with a dented cooking pot. The crowd laughed. By late afternoon, someone lit a match, not out of malice, not out of impulse, a moment of theater. Nothing more. The flame caught slowly, the fabric smoldered, then curled. It smelled of dust and grease. The embroidery hissed briefly as the thread cracked and popped. No one stopped it. A few adults turned to watch. No one intervened. One vendor nodded to himself. Took long enough. Another asked if it was legal. Doesn't matter, someone else replied. It's not a flag anymore. A municipal clerk passing through made a brief note in her log. Unregistered open flame in sector square 4. Debris included expired textile banner of unknown provenance. Crowd nonviolent, no intervention required. She drew a line beneath the entry and closed her book. At dusk, only a black smear remained. Some children traced shapes in the ash. One girl said it looked like a hand. Another said it looked like nothing. What was it anyway? Someone asked. Something from before, came the answer. The children kept drawing. None of them asked again. The census of 1003 AG, 1003 years after the believed time the Guardians had begun to walk Orfyd, was the most complete in Priimydia's recorded history. Every household was registered, every address confirmed, names, trades, affiliation, all logged by hand and transferred to copperplate registry. The work took 9 months and even cost a few lives, most to cold or sickness. It was still declared a success. The final tally: total registered citizens, 4,480,000. Classified civilian, 4,002,000. Municipal personnel, 140,000. Civic dependents, 338,000. The volumes were bound in black leather and stored in the civic archive beneath the central hall. No blessings were issued, no commemorative speech was given, just a stamped receipt and a single iron key. The official seal was updated the same week. 12 points, one blank circle. The first time it appeared on paper, it was mistaken for an error in printing. Nothing at the center means no one rules, wrote the archivist who submitted the final report. He added it as a personal note. No one responded. He included it anyway. The old O's were not outlawed, they were simply excluded. The phrase first guardian was removed from the academy textbooks. The word mandate was redefined in the civic lexicon to mean temporary operational authority. Children were still taught to memorize symbols, but now only those on the coinage. A building was locked. A hall was repurposed for ledger storage. A monument was mislabeled and quickly left to erode. Most people did not forget. They simply stopped bringing it up. In a school outside the city walls, a child raised her hand. Was there really a man who never wore a crown but still ruled everything? The teacher glanced toward the door, then back to the child. We study systems, not stories. That's enough. The lesson continued. No one asked again. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Blade Beneath the Roots. The floor plans didn't match. That was the first thing the surveyor noticed. A thin deviation, a line on the archival diagram that didn't exist in the actual corridor, or rather, one that did exist physically but had no corresponding entry in the current civic schema. He tapped the wall with a knuckle, hollow, just behind the ventilation shaft, on sub-level 3 of the Eastern Records Annex, a blind hallway, unlit, unmaintained, but still dry, still solid, still built. He marked the coordinates on his slate, scribbled possible pre-charter vault. The office was compiling structural redundancies for earthquake retrofits. No one expected discoveries, especially not here. Beneath one of the most well-documented, least important civic buildings in the Republic. The next day, he returned with a mapping lens, held it to the wall. There was an outline beneath the plaster, a seam, faint, deliberate, something fused shut, not blocked, not buried, closed. The lens returned no material anomalies, no radiation, no source tag, just a corridor, 8 meters long, ending in a rectangular slab with no signage, no crest, and no door frame. He submitted the report by midday. It was categorized under non-urgent architectural variants and marked for review by the Bureau of Spatial Integrity. Review status, low. Clearance requested, none. Expected action, follow up within 90 working days. He closed the file and went home. The next morning, his clearance code was revoked. He had spoken it aloud, but was denied access. He received a note from records. Anomalous corridor previously recorded in Restoration Phase 7 as sealed utility recess. Defer to existing annotations. No further inspection required. There were no annotations in the Restoration ledger. He checked twice. When he returned to the corridor that evening, the seam had been replastered. He could still see the curve of the corner if he squinted. He stood there for several minutes, then placed his hand on the wall, not in defiance, not in curiosity, just to remember the shape of what was missing. 2 levels above, in a dark file room of the Department of Records Review, a clerk opened the flagged report and read it 3 times. Then, without speaking, they placed it in a folder marked PRE-FN-AL, large hyphen, hold for obscure purposes, period. The folder was slotted into a drawer labeled Tier 5. The drawer was locked and no record of its contents ever entered into the official collection space. The packet came in a plain envelope. It bore no crest, no classification seal, only a line of ink stamped across the across the front in uniform uppercase. It read, Red Line Update, Lexicon 73B, Obsolete Entries, effective immediately. The clerk at the Lexicon Authority was used to these. Most were trivial, deprecated phrases, obsolete trade names, standard spellings replaced by modern shorthand. The last update had removed 8 compound conjunctions and 1 type of poetic meter. She logged the envelope's arrival, scanned the list. Most entries were unsurprising. Honor-bound, deprecated, overvalorized. High speech, deprecated, archaic elitism. Godsworn, removed, conflicts with Charter, Section 2. Then, the line that made them stop. Arbiter, remove entirely, term no longer recognized, usage disallowed in all civic, academic, and cartographic documentation. Classification, null referent. The clerk read it twice. She pulled up the linguistic registry index manual. The term was still archived there, albeit sparsely. No definition was provided, just a single cross-reference to a Volt entry in the early Civic Memory Codex. They tried to access it, but on the door, before they even tried, read, Access denied only to entry sealed, defer to records oversight. She left her desk during second interval and stood at the printing press station, proceeding to replace a spool. No one noticed. She tore a page from her ledger and wrote the word by hand. Arbiter. She didn't know what it had meant, only that it had once mattered enough to erase. That evening, in her flat, she unfolded the note again, traced the shape of the letters with a thumb. No script had ever defined it, no law had ever repealed it. It had simply been allowed to vanish. She opened a fresh notebook, wrote the word again, underlined it, closed the cover, filed it on a shelf between reference grammars and trade law volumes. No one would ever look there, and if she did, she would find nothing illegal, just a word with no meaning. The garden east of the Civic Assembly Hall were maintained without ceremony. They were not meant to be beautiful, only ordered. Native plants, mild-angled beds, gravel pathways, calibrated to optimize drainage. No markers, no statues, just a clean, neutral public space designed to signify nothing. But near the wall, where the grounds curved inward toward the old district, one thing had been left unaltered. A tree. Tall, rough-barked, crown full but uneven, stone at the base, like old ironwork gone to ruin, roots grown over something ancient and strange. Most visitors ignored it, but the groundskeeper did not. He had worked these gardens for 12 years. Before that, he served in the war. Before that, there wasn't much to say. He'd held a different name then, let it go after the transition, kept his hands busy. He didn't think of the war often, but he remembered the weight of the blade, the way it rang when grounded in stone, the silence afterward. He remembered being told not to speak of it. He first noticed the change during pruning. The sole around the base had shifted, not by much, a few centimeters, but he could feel it. Not by much, a few fingertips length across. But he could feel it. The roots had pulled back slightly, curling inward instead of out. A hollow formed just beneath the southern arch, where previously it had been flush. He crouched, brushed the dirt aside. Stone. Not dead stone, not foundation slab, something shaped, faintly angled, cornered, as if it had once held a name. He didn't touch it, just pressed the earth back down, slowly, respectfully. That night, he returned with a ledger. He had never kept one before, not in war, not since. He drew the outline of the tree, marked the edge of the hollow, noted the bark condition, the humidity, the direction of branch growth. He closed the book, placed it beneath his cot, slept poorly. In the weeks that followed, the changes continued. The tree didn't die, it receded, suddenly. Bark grew smoother, the upper limbs lost some reach. Its mass diminished, though its shape remained intact, like a drawing rubbed gently with a claw. It looked lighter, not ill, not fading, just withdrawing, as though it no longer wished to be where it was. On the 14th night, he returned again, sat beneath the tree, back against the stone. He did not speak, but after a while he placed his hand against the root, closed his eyes, and nodded. The roots pulled inward like breath. It was not sudden, it was not loud. The change occurred beneath the soil line, slow as water shaping stone. No one had measured the mass of the tree, nor tracked its reach. No instruments had been designed to detect retreat. And yet, it was happening. Bark slowed in thin strips like sunburnt skin. The stone webbing at the base of the trunk lost density. Flecks the size of grains, then coins, then buttons. The groundskeeper noticed a cavity forming between two major roots. It hadn't been there the week before. He logged it quietly, marked the depth, said nothing to the committee. Within a month, the root structure had receded by 2 handspans. Not collapsed, not rotted, simply withdrawn, as though the tree were peeling away from its place in the world. Far away, in a stretch of inland rock bordered by cliffs and wind-stunted grass, on a continent the Priimydians had never named, the soil split. No light came from the opening, no song, no voice, only a crack in the ground, small, curved at first, then splintered outward as though something below had exhaled through stone. Within days, the crack darkened, blackened, thickened. Locals in the area, a scattered people, mostly herders and stonecutters, noticed birds avoiding the ridge. Dogs would not step near the fracture. One child dropped a wooden bead into the hole and said she heard it land on something soft. Then came the shoot, thin, pale gray, damp with dew that had not fallen. It rose from the center of the split with a gentle curl, like a question unfurling. The outer skin was lined with a pattern no one could read, not language but shape, a slow spiral of vein and grain. One man said it looked like bone, another said it looked like home. The tree did not grow quickly, it grew correctly, bent with purpose, rooted as though memory guided it from below. Each new branch followed an unseen blueprint. Each leaf opened in silence, and yet carried a shape that made some of the locals draw it again and again on stone and hide. There were no words for it, but people began to come, not in caravans or rituals, not in prayer, just drawn, quietly. Some began building shelters nearby. No one asked why. The slate was clean when the lesson began. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and damp linen. It was early, second period, and the walls still held the gray cold of the early morning. A kettle hissed softly at the back of the room, steaming over a low coil connected to a fire, a rudimentary stove. The sound kept the children calm. It was a standard civic school. Outer districts, 2 instructors, 24 students. The older teacher, thin and flat-voiced, handled numeric instruction. The younger one, sharper-eyed, led lexical foundations. Today's lesson, primary Republican symbols. The 12 points, the blank circle, the numberless archive. The instructor tapped the board. These are not pictures. They are structures. Draw them as such. No labels, no stories. Each child was given a wax slate and a length of gray chalk. She walked the rows in silence, adjusting posture, correcting angles. One student had drawn the 12 points as a sunburst. She erased it immediately. No meaning, only form. Then she reached the boy in the 3rd row. He hadn't drawn the seal, he had drawn something else. At first it looked like a torch or a sword, but neither felt right. The hilt flared too low. The proportions were imbalanced. The blade was too long, not ornamental, but deliberate. The weight of the thing sat oddly in the lines, as if it had been drawn from memory, not invention. It disturbed her. She said nothing. She took the slate, replaced it with a new one, placed the old drawing on her desk beneath a sheet of blank parchment. Start again, she said. Clean this time. The boy obeyed, quietly, no protest, no confusion, as if he had expected the correction. That evening, the teacher sat at her desk beneath a single glass lamp. She had taken the drawing home, folded it into a reference manual on civic iconography. No one had seen. She folded the parchment, laid the slate beside it. She stared at the drawing again. It wasn't a weapon, not exactly. The shape was wrong for combat, but there was balance in it, a kind of emotional geometry that made her chest tighten slightly. The vertical weight, the taper, the cross line just beneath the tip. Not a guard, but a boundary. The feeling wasn't recognition, it was pressure. She pulled down the symbol index. A thick, red-bound volume, cross-checked, abstracted forms from 3 centuries of state-approved banners. Nothing matched. Then she consulted the contraband reference appendum. Unofficial, incomplete, but maintained carefully in her private cabinet. Still nothing, but the design wouldn't leave her alone. The shape was simple, but it insisted. She could feel its edge even in thought, not sharp, but decisive. She copied it once. The hand trembled, then again, smoother. Then a third time, small and precise, on the back of an old roll call sheet. She added a label, unknown, possibly remembered. She placed the page between the folds of an unused ledger and slid it into a drawer. Then turned out the light. She did not sleep easily. It took time to notice the absence. There had never been an announcement, no decree, no removal order. The stone tree had stood at the edge of the civic gardens for generations, too old to honor, too familiar to question. It had become part of the landscaping, a massive, motionless shadow that required occasional pruning, but little thought. Now it was simply gone, not chopped, not burned, just gone. No slump, no splinters, only bare earth, slightly discolored, soft underfoot. A depression, round and shallow, like something had lifted itself free. The groundskeeper said nothing. When questioned by an apprentice, he just handed over the new planting schedule and walked away. Above the gardens, daily life continued. The paper routes ran on time. The records were shelved. The ink carts came down from the hills. The forms gathered, debated, dismissed, but beneath the rhythm of routine, small inconsistencies began to gather. A stone marker shifted half an inch off true, and no one could explain how. A standard calendar run returned 4 misprints with different dates from presses that had never malfunctioned. One morning, the wind blew from the east, and the seasonal maps said it should not. None of it was dramatic, none of it was reported, but the older clerks and gardeners rose earlier than they used to, and more than one looked twice the horizon before beginning the day. A weight had lifted, and something else had slipped free in its place. Far beyond the island, past the coastal reaches, past the broken remnants of the wall, in a land not charted on any republic map, the tree stood again. It had not landed, it had not been replanted, it had reappeared. The bark was pale, then darkening, the base wide and uneven, as though shaped by memory, not seed. Its roots pierced the earth like stakes, older than the soil that now held them, and within, the core of its trunk, quiet and sealed, the arbiter. Not waiting, not sleeping, not aware, but present, in the place it needed to be. No light escaped from it, no voice echoed from within it, no summons had been sent. But something in the ground knew, something in the sky shifted. No one in Priimydia would feel it again. Would feel it yet. But the world had already begun to turn. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Law Without Memory. It was a children's story told on a small corner of South Assembly Square, just past the midday hour, with no platform and no charge. The orator, an old man with parchment voice and careful hands, had no stall, no bench, just a worn mat and a half circle of children seated in front of him. He spoke clearly, calmly. He used no names at first, only shapes. A woman carried no blade, but never bled. A woman carried no blade, but never bled. She had never bled for anything. This was the state of the city, a city that turned its gates inward. A man who left a throne he never sat on. The children watched without speaking. One of them smiled. The man in uniform stood near the fountain. He was not a soldier. The Republic no longer had those, at least in name. But he wore the jacket of civic order liaison. With 2 stripes on the cuff of a leather-bound incident ledger beneath one arm. He did not interrupt the story. He recorded the time, the subject, the summary, and the phrase that did not belong. The one who stepped down and left the world in balance. The phrase wasn't outlawed, it simply wasn't listed. The new municipal guidelines were clear. No reference shall be made to historical personae not found within the approved civic index. The orator was called in 2 days later, not arrested, not charged, just summoned. A polite notice delivered by hand to the boarding house where he rented a single room on the top floor. He arrived at the Office of Community Expression before opening hour, waited. Then, when called, he stepped inside and stood behind the red thread on the floor. You spoke a name not listed, said the official. I didn't speak a name, the old man replied, but you described one. There was no anger in his voice, just precision. His license was not revoked in anger, it was retired. The record showed no offense, only closure of classification 13P, effective immediately. He signed the paper without question. They gave him tea before he left. He no longer came to the square. The mat remained in his closet. The children found other corners. The stories found no new mouths. But once, only once, the baker's daughter passed his door and saw him inside, facing the window, speaking softly with his eyes closed, telling something to the empty air. The file was misfiled by 1 row and 17 letters. It had slipped behind a stack of old transport permits, brittle, copper-tagged, pre-standardization. The clerk found it by accident while realigning the year 1003 intake shelf, which had begun to sag from humidity. She wasn't looking for anything important, just trying to prevent another collapse. The parchment was pale and thin, older than her by decades, but still intact. Registry format 4B, birth certification. She enrolled it carefully. Name, Aristes, son of Camor, 974 AG. Civic classification, non-military. Verification, incomplete. Notes, former assignment, Civic Defense Division, Guardian War Cohort. She paused, blinked, read it again. There were no official offenses listed, no seals of censorship, but the final notation had been underlined in faded red ink, long since dulled to brown. Guardian War Cohort. She leaned back in her chair and closed the folder. The name rang faintly in her mind, like something out of place on a familiar street. She had heard it before, a single time. Her father, in winter, after too much boiled wine. A low voice, speaking not to her, but to the stone. There was one, Aristes, son of Camor. He stood when the others knelt or ran. She hadn't remembered it clearly until now. She looked around. The sorting chamber was empty, just her and the cabinets, the paper, the dust. According to protocol, any reference to pre-index militant designations were to be red flagged and passed directly to the Department of Language Hygiene. It would be burned, logged as terminological sanitation. No record would remain. She opened her personal ledger, tore a scrap from the page, and wrote the name by hand. Just the name, not the date, not the affiliation, not even the father. Then she resealed the parchment, tagged it as voided, placed it in the red bin for destruction. No one would question it. The paper trail was perfect. That evening, she returned to her quarters late. The corridor lanterns burned low. Her fingers smelled of ink and metal. She sat at her desk, took out the folded scrap, unfolded it, stared at the name, Aristes. She said it aloud, once, then again, more quietly. She held it over the oil lamp, hesitated, and let it go. The paper curled instantly, turned black at the edges, then to ash. She watched the flame die down, closed her eyes. Sleep came in parts. The wind scraped against the shutters. Her blankets held no warmth. Somewhere in the middle hours she woke, not from a noise, but from something else. Stillness, deep, heavy, thick as standing water. There was a shape in the corner of the room. Not close, not far, not moving. No face, no light. Just weight, presence, attention. She didn't cry out, she didn't look away. She only stared, and the shape stared back. When morning came, the shape was gone. But the air in the room was colder than it had been in months. She did not light the stove. She arrived at the archive early, logged in silently, and requested a blank ledger. It was the last lesson of the day. The classroom windows faced west, and the afternoon sun had begun to fall behind the municipal stacks. Long shadows from the ledger town stripped the floor. The instructor lit the wall lamp early to keep the geometry of the room stable. The subject was civic cartography, 12-year cohort. Basic topography, coastline, elevation, river route lines. The children were instructed to copy the Republic's official island form from memory. Each student had practiced it for weeks. The coastline had no name. It was simply referred to as Form 1. It was expected to be drawn cleanly and without deviation. No flourishes, the inspector reminded them. No invention. Each slate was inspected before issuance. Each chalk stick measured to ensure uniform consumption. The desks were aligned to the south-facing grid. Every detail accounted for. Precision, not imagination. He walked the aisles with slow, even steps. Most of the children drew faithfully. The curve of the north reach, the flat spine of the western shelf, the hollow of the inland bay. A few slates were smudged and gently corrected. Then he reached the pair in the back corner. Two boys, identical assignments, identical deviants. To the southeast, in a space meant to remain empty, both slates bore the same strange addition. A faint curve, a ghost of land, a peninsula that didn't belong. It wasn't just a scribble, it had shape. It looked drawn from memory. The instructor didn't speak. He marked the slates with a correct ribbon, logged the infraction code. The boys looked at him, not guiltily, not smugly, just watching, as if waiting to see whether he would say what they already knew. He didn't. That evening, after dismissal and lockup, he returned to the empty classroom. The slates were stacked for audit, but he pulled the two from the correction pile, set them aside, side by side, on his desk. He studied them in the lamplight. The curve was delicate, organic, not a gesture of rebellion, a gesture of return. He flipped open the Civic Geographical Codex, cross-checked all historical overlays and amendment plates. No such landform had ever been discovered. He checked again. Nothing. Still, the shape lingered, not in knowledge, but in his hands. He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, pulled out an old sheet of personal paper. Not state-issued, hand-pulped, rough-edged, from his youth. He hadn't used it in years. He took up a blank chalk and began to draw, slowly, not copying, just following the shape. From memory, he did not know he had. The curve formed itself, became a body, a presence, a place. When it was done, he leaned back. The outline was unfamiliar, but it felt inevitable. He folded the paper into thirds, slipped it into his coat pocket, closed the drawer, blew out the lamp. He had never left the island. But something in him had already returned. The measure passed without debate. It was officially titled the Clarity Accord, an amendment to the Civic Expression Codex framed as a linguistic efficiency initiative. No one called it censorship. The word had long since been retired from formal use. The proposal was introduced as a single sheet motion, signed by 6 mid-level senators and reviewed by the Language Integrity Subcommittee. No one objected. It was placed on the docket, voted on, ratified, effective immediately. Its effects were not immediate. That was the brilliance of it. The law did not ban any books. It did not confiscate writing. It did not erase names. Instead, it refined language. Terms of uncertain origin were deprecated. References with non-standard temporal alignment were flagged for review. Allusions to unnamed figures or metaphorical constructs were suspended pending clarification. The bureaucrats smiled. Writers fell silent. Instructors were told to adjust curriculum accordingly. Editors were advised to excise ambiguity. Public signage was revised to remove lyrical phrasing. One clause stood out to a handful of observers. No term shall be used which, upon inspection, refers to a person, concept, or event no longer held within the civic index or registered under active memory preservation. The phrase was legally perfect and functionally lethal. It removed not only myths, but the language that could build them. In the Civic Archives building, a single copy of the old index was boxed and marked unaligned, obsolete. It was shelved in the sub-basement behind 2 locks. No one ever came to read it, but it remained thin and dustless, as if waiting. One woman, a young translator in the subcommittee's copy office, noticed a phrase that had been quietly dropped. The silent one who steps aside. She remembered reading it once, carved beneath a stone relief near the south garden gate. She returned that evening, found the stone. The phrase had been scraped away. She touched the blank space with her fingers, then with the side of her hand, then with her forehead, not out of ritual, but just to know that something had once been there. It happened in the middle of market day. The southern square was at full churn. Footsteps slick with dust, fabric canopies snapping in the breeze. The smell of dried citrus and boiled roots cutting through the midday warmth. The sound of shouting vendors rang against the stone. Names of goods thrown like signals across the square. At a modest linen stall near the inner curve of the market ring, a woman leaned forward to fold a pale shawl, soft-stitched, gold-edged. She smiled faintly to herself, then under her breath, barely audible, a phrase, just 5 words, not directed at anyone, not for sale, just something said. A patrolman nearby, taking notes for a conduct log, heard it. He didn't catch the exact words, only their cadence. Old, rounded, unfiled. He stepped toward her, boots silent on the packed stone. Repeat that, please. She looked up, not startled, just caught. I was speaking to myself. Was the phrase in record? No. It was something my grandmother used to say. Do you know the origin? She hesitated, then shook her head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask again. He tapped once on his ledger, detached a single slip. Notice of review, he said. Verbal non-alignment. Is there a charge? No, just temporary review. He handed her the slip, nodded once, and walked on. The next morning, her stall was closed. The canvas tarp had been rolled tight, the weights unhooked, the chalk price board was blank, the bolts of linen inside remained unfolded, untouched. The review office had posted a small square of parchment at the base of the stall, suspended, classification 7F, review in progress, no intervention required. No guards, no marking, no public discussion. Most passed by without slowing. 3 days remained. The stall remained undisturbed. Dust began to gather along the edge of the plank table. Children chased each other in spirals between the empty benches. No one moved the cloths. No one mentioned her name. On the 4th morning, someone, it wasn't clear who, rubbed the parchment notice away. No new posting replaced it, just a smear of chalk, just vacancy. By week's end, a tool vendor had moved into the space. Iron hooks now hung from the back rail, and leather belts crisscrossed over new beams. A polished weight scale had been bolted into the front plank. A boy pointed to the change and asked his mother where the linen woman had gone. She looked down and said simply, "She must have moved." When someone in the market authority office was asked later about the stall reassignment, the answer came without hesitation. No incident recorded. Reallocation standard. The logbook showed no entry at all. She woke before the first light, not from a noise, not from a dream. Just woke. The house was still. The roof beams clinked faintly with cooling air. Her mother's breathing from the other room was soft and even. but she sat upright, her eyes open, and a single word into the dark. Arbiter. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't remember dreaming it. But the shape of the word was clear, solid, as if it had been placed in her mouth by someone else's memory. She rose, wrapped herself in her nightcloth, and went to the hearth. The chalk from yesterday's slate lesson still sat on the ledge. She picked it up and drew the word on the wall beside the box, slowly, carefully, the way her teacher had taught her, to form civic terms. Arbiter. She traced it twice, then sat the chalk down and went back to sleep. By morning the word had washed away. A trickle of roof water from the night storm had run down the wall and smeared the chalk into a pale gray shadow. Her mother saw the mark while cleaning, wiped it clean, and said nothing, but the girl noticed. She stared at the space where the word had been. Later that day, when her mother wasn't looking, she drew it again. She kept doing it, in the margins of slates, on the underside of tabletops, on stones near the court path. She never asked what it meant, she never said it aloud again, but her hand kept finding a shape. Her wrist remembered the motion, and her mind held still while she traced. The name was not taught, it had not been written in her books, it had not been spoken in her home. But it would return, not through rebellion, not through revelation, only through a child's hand, repeating a forgotten word. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. A war that believed itself clean. It was not an expedition. There were no scouts, no banners, no vote in the Senate, no fanfare. It was a cargo ship. Iron-ribbed, 30 lengths of a man from hull to prow. Commissioned for grain transport and equipped with 6 civilian crew and a trade clerk. It departed from the northwestern port of the island. Northwestern port of the island, under calm skies. Scheduled for a coastal circuit, no one expected it to cross the edge of the world. But the wall was gone. The sea no longer looped. 16 days later, the ship returned, early, quietly, without full cargo. Its hull was salt-streaked in a pattern no one recognized. The sails hung stiff. One of the crew, a junior deckhand, was taken straight to medical review. He couldn't speak. He kept looking over his shoulder. The clerk's report was short, precise, and unnerving. Found land. Not a peninsula. Not mapped. Large. No resistance. Occupied. Settled. Architecture civic. Stonework. Elevation. Inhabitants composed. Spoke. Not in index tongue. Gave no name. Accepted no item. Watched us. Never gestured threat. But just stood there. At first, the Senate doubted them. Maps were triple-checked. Tides analyzed. The records from the Age of Guardians were reviewed. None showed a continental landmass west of the known island chain. West of the known island. But the coordinates held, the wind patterns were uncorrupted, and the ship had brought something back. A simple carved stone, smooth, angular, etched with repeating marks, not letters, not quite. It didn't match any known alphabet in the civic archive. 2 weeks later, a second ship was dispatched, this time under quiet, Senate sanction. No soldiers, only scholars and interpreters. A cartographer was assigned, but given strict orders not to redraw any official map until the land is named with consent. The ship did not return. The next to go was a long-range merchant vessel, independently chartered, bearing metal tools, fabric, bolts, and a full diplomatic chest. It reached the coast and anchored in clear sight of what the captain described as a structured port, wide stone quay, terraced civic halls, organized market lanes. The inhabitants emerged slowly. They wore cloaks marked in geometric patterns. They bore no weapons. They did not bow. They did not retreat. They watched. They walked the piers, and they waited. The Priimydians disembarked. They made no demands. They offered gifts, displayed goods, laid out coinage, and standardized weights. The Ilurians, the name would come later, received the offerings without comment. They neither accepted nor returned them. At dusk, a small group of Ilurians constructed a table of stone and seated themselves. They did not speak. One of them began to hum, a slow, cyclical chant. The scribe on board described it as melodic, metered, untranslatable, but eerily familiar. That night, the trade clerk aboard the ship reported dreams of wind breaking over slate. He woke with a nosebleed and a phrase in his mouth he did not recognize. When the ship returned, it brought no treaties, no hostilities, just impressions, patterns, and one line spoken by the interpreter before she resigned her post. They live with time in a different shape than we do. There was no declaration, no doctrine, no open colonization. There was only trade. The Senate, quiet in its language, approved a series of civic expansions, external exchange posts, index-adjusted measure centers, and regional consistency zones. No one called them forts. No one called it occupation. Maps were updated. New harbors were marked in dotted lines. Territories were not named, only aligned. A standing force was established, not called an army, but a civil stability contingent, drawn from veterans, orphans, and top-score civic graduates. They wore full plate armor, bore halberds and pikes, and rotated in shifts of 1 month per outpost. They were trained to speak in measured tones, recite from the index of conduct, and avoid visible aggression. Cannons were placed, but only 2 per site. Tents were stone-walled, square-formed, and clean. Flags of the Republic were flown without anthem. The Ilurians said nothing. They did not resist. They did not greet. They came to trade when necessary, offering dried herbs, black glass, and rough metal tools, then returned home without comment. They adopted none of the Republic's measures. They did not standardize weights. They did not accept civic coin. They did not share their names. A Republic envoy suggested bilingual signage. The proposal was received, then returned, unread, folded inwards. At the port nearest Priimydia, with the ports, at the port at the southern tip of the land now labeled Iluria, a full set of Priimydian street markers was installed, exact to civic standard. Within a week, the signs had been physically turned around to face inward. No vandalism, no damage, just reversed, quietly, completely. When reported, the Senate envoy remarked, "Let them face their own names, if not ours." A water measurement dispute followed. An Ilurian merchant claimed 1 cask short. The scale was recalibrated twice. The Republic certified the weight, filed the correction, and documented the exchange as closed. The next morning, the scale had been shattered into 6 identical wedges, arranged like petals across the stone. No one was seen, no accusations made. The site was labeled temporarily disrupted. No sign was replaced. The Ilurian priest approached an outpost in silence. He carried no paper, no emissary badge. He placed a bundle of feathers at the gate, nodded once, and left. A civic guard recorded the incident as local right, non-threatening. Symbolic exchange, undefined. The feathers were stored, filed under anomalous material. They never decomposed. By the end of the season, trade volumes had slowed. Ilurian presence in the exchange sites declined by half. No complaint was lodged, no protest raised, only absence. And behind the outpost in the woods, beyond the stone plaza, small markers began to appear. Wooden stakes tied in pairs with red cord, spaced evenly, facing east, unlabeled. When asked if they were grave markers, the civic scribe responded, "I don't think anyone's died yet." The rejection came in a bundle of clay sheets pressed by hand, carried by an Ilurian envoy without escort, delivered to the exchange gate in silence. No wax, no ribbon, no civic format, just 32 etched slabs, bound with a red cord and weighted by a single shard of black glass. Each sheet bore a single phrase in the Ilurian civic script. The translator, one of three in active service, rendered the full text as, "We have accepted no map. We have signed no weight. We do not give names to land that already has them. We will not be indexed." The Senate convened an emergency session, not over the message, but over the refusal to follow any known diplomatic structure. "There is no letterhead," one senator noted. "No recipient," said another. "No counterweight, no civic anchor, no return form." The chancellor's conclusion was final. "This cannot be treated as valid. They have refused correspondence." A vote was called. The Republic would issue a declaration of formal alignment. The vote passed. Iluria would be brought under structured order, peacefully, if possible. The first campaign mobilized within 3 weeks. 3,000 soldiers, 12 ships, 4 senior commanders. A third of them had never seen combat. They were clean, well-drilled, indexed. Their oaths were read aloud in civic amphora before embarkation. A new crest was minted for the campaign, 2 hands extended above a civic compass. No sword, no flame. Ilurian resistance began before the first column reached the interior. Messages were sent ahead, not intercepted but received. Scouts reported roads blocked by stacked stones and sloped mud. No battles, no formations, but the settlements ahead were empty. Civic maps were accurate, but each target arrived blank. A Republic outpost was found collapsed. No impact, no fire, just folded. Roofs sunken inward, doorways sealed, inscriptions inverted. Soldiers rebuilt it in 4 days. On the 5th day, it rained indoors. The Ilurians returned, not in mass, not in violence. They walked to the edge of a bridge, stood in formation, 9 across, and unfurled a red clay disc bearing their civic glyph. It was not a flag, it was not a threat, but the Republic interpreted it as a territorial claim. The next morning, the disc was shattered. The army advanced. The first engagement occurred at a low ridge near the town called Orm. Ilurian defenders held position in a tight wedge, armed with long spears and reinforced shields. They made no chant. No fire rose from the ground. No air turned sideways. They fought with technique, and when outflanked, withdrew in order. 3 Priimydian soldiers died. 12 Ilurians were taken prisoner. The town fell by nightfall. A formal victory was declared, but the map hadn't moved. The line of occupation was unchanged. The towns beyond had already emptied, and somewhere behind the ridge, a new stack of stones appeared. White, dry, perfectly squared, and when questioned, the translator said only, "They are counting." The war became a matter of routing. Every town was mapped, every road was measured, every campaign milestone was tracked in weeks, not months. The Senate received quarterly updates, minimal resistance, terrain cooperative, objectives achieved. Each engagement was brief, tactical victories stacked cleanly in the ledgers, supply lines held, casualty rates were low. The Republic celebrated efficiency. The Ilurians didn't fight to win. They defended lines, not cities. They chose moments, not fronts. And when a town fell, they did not return to reclaim it. They walked away, not in retreat, but in refusal. By the end of the second year, Priimydian forces held the entire southern coast and 5 cities inland, all declared stabilized. Temples were boarded, civic weights installed, children taught the index of speech. But in each city after dark, small clay discs were found on the rooftops, painted red, inscribed with nothing. The garrison commanders filed them as non-violent anomalies. They were smashed and swept. Each morning they returned. Commanders began to write complaints, not about the enemy's strength, but about duration. They don't engage us, they exhaust us. We win, but there is no center to take. Each campaign resets the moment it succeeds. One general asked to resign. He was denied. The 4th year opened with a full push north. With a full push north. 12,000 troops were rotated through in relay. They seized a fortified town in 7 days. The Ilurians set fire to the aqueduct, not with oil but ice. No one could explain how it cracked. The water still ran, but the taste changed. A field surgeon reported notes of copper and citrus in the wellspring. Ilurian forces never massed. Instead, they shadowed columns, disrupted timings, set weather against schedules. Winds blew counter to cannon angle. Dry seasons grew damp. Scouts found familiar trails misaligned. But the Priimydians adapted. They fortified positions, indexed new routes, recalibrated grain weights for damp storage, and they advanced. By the end of year 5, the Republicans seized all major roads and declared the campaign complete. The Senate published maps without red lines. Iluria was renamed a civil territory under civic reorientation. A new anthem was drafted. Children recited it in class. A marble tablet was carved and delivered to each outpost. Victory by order. But the soldiers no longer sang. Commanders spoke less often, and letters home took longer to write. A courier captain noted, "Nothing resists, but nothing bends." The first death was logged as heat stroke. It happened in a sudden supply station outside of one of the northern garrisons. A young quartermaster collapsed while recounting winter grain. He had no fever, just a nosebleed, a seizure, and silence. A second followed 3 days later, this time a cook in a central outpost kitchen, then a cartographer, then a child visiting his father from the capital. There was no pattern, no shared exposure, only timing. The physicians disagreed. Some blamed river water, others suggested mold in the flour supply. A few called for expanded testing. The military called for restraint. Unknown illness contained, no present threat to operations. Within a month, symptoms coalesced. Memory disruption, language slippage, skin pallor, vein blackening, coughing blood, final silence. It moved slowly, then rapidly. From soldier to clerk, from clerk to household, from garrison to capital. Hospitals filled, then emptied, not with recovery, but with orders. The Senate refrained from using the word plague. Instead, they called it Civil Burden Strain Variant Red. They formed a committee. They issued cloth masks in neutral gray. They reduced troop rotation and suspended mail. None of it helped. By the end of the second month, a quarter of the coastal garrisons were dead. Command fell to junior officers. Junior officers stopped reporting. Whole towns locked their gates, not against Ilurians, but against the roads. No civic orphanage was sealed. A civic orphanage was sealed, not by decree, but by stone. One boy inside scratched the word "help" on the window backwards. It stayed there, even after the glass cracked later. In the capital, the Senate dissolved public meetings. Elections were postponed. The Chancellor delivered her final address through parchment decree. The parchment read, "We do not surrender. We pause for health." The next morning she was dead. Her place was taken by a committee of 12. The Republic surrendered 3 weeks later. It wasn't called a surrender. It was called mutual suspension of advance. There were no battlefield losses, no treaty signing, just a halt and a silence. In the forests of Regum, as was the continent that they explored came to be known, the Ilurians did not celebrate. They simply stopped counting. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Fevered City. The bells stopped ringing, not because anyone forbade them, but because no one pulled the rope. At first the chimes grew irregular, missing the hour, mistiming the day. Then one tower's rope snapped from rot. In another, the bell was stolen and melted down for currency to buy food. By the time winter touched the city's eastern plazas, no one noticed the silence. It had become part of the schedule. The fever peaked in the second year, or what they guessed was the second. Time was a suggestion. Calendars were no longer reprinted. Clerks stopped dating correspondence if they sent it at all. Most simply burned what they could not answer. Letters piled in alleys. Scribes folded them into fire without opening a seal. Couriers still walked the routes, but fewer each month. Those who remained stopped knocking. They left bundles by thresholds and prayed they were never called back. In the western quarter, all the physicians' houses turned black. Charcoal on door frames, red soot in the mortar seemed a symbol to say, "No more here, go elsewhere." The mark was not standardized, but it spread. The civic forums were quietest of all, where once orators stood beneath the obelisk and debated grain rationing or speech harmonics, now smoke rose from shallow pits. Not ceremonial, but funeral. The dead outpaced the record books, and then the record books, like the dead, began to burn. The great archive of measures closed its doors on a mid-cycle morning. No announcement. The guards sealed it with a length of brass wire and turned their backs. A child watched from across the plaza. When she returned that evening, the building was gone. Not destroyed, just missing. Like a tooth no one remembered having. People stopped marking graves. There weren't enough stones. There weren't enough graves. Instead, names were whispered into pots of dirt and placed by doorways. Most of the pots cracked. Some were taken. The names were not repeated. A story spread, quiet and unverified, that a civic printer had tried to issue a public health bulletin. But when the press began to run, the ink turned transparent. The paper caught fire. No one investigated. The printer closed. Its sign was removed. In one corridor of the Capitol, a child was heard coughing for 5 nights straight. On the 6th night, the coughing stopped, and a neighbor left bread by the door. No one took it. In the end, there were no orders, no curfews, no declarations of martial rule. There were only absences. One day, the grain inspectors simply stopped coming. The next, the waste collectors did not arrive. The third, the street lights were left unlit, not out of rebellion, but exhaustion. The city was not panicked, it was patient. It was exhausted, spent, like something trying to remember how to fall asleep. At first, the census fell behind by days, then weeks, then entirely. The clerk stopped correcting names, then stopped filing them, then stopped asking. No one declared the census ended. It simply failed to arrive. Births still happened, but they were not recorded. Midwives no longer filed forms. Parents no longer sought registration. The civic registry turned thin, then brittle, then blank. A child was born on the eastern slope of the Capitol. Her father wrote her name on the wall outside his home. A week later, someone painted it over with whitewash. He did not reapply it. The archive of measures had once tracked every event. Marriage, death, trade, injury, mood. The logs grew quieter by the hour. The final recorded entry read, request, adjust rainfall entry for mid-cycle. Result, unknown, no reply. Conclusion, nothing. The logbook was found years later. With no ink left on the page. Names became negotiable. A man in the forum introduced himself twice in the same conversation, once to a baker, once to a clerk, but the names were different. No one corrected him. At the ration house, a woman gave her father's name to receive double. She wept while doing it, then came back the next day and used her own. The clerk said nothing. Civic identification tokens were no longer minted. The metal was needed elsewhere, so people began wearing strips of parchment, but rain dissolved them. A merchant solved it by tattooing his name on his wrist. Others followed suit, but the ink was inconsistent, and so were the names. One boy had his name tattooed 5 times across his chest, each one different. When asked which one was correct, he replied, "The one that gets me fed." The Senate sent out a circular in the 3rd year, a questionnaire on public mood. Less than 1% responded. Of those, most returned the parchment blank. A few drew spirals. One tore the page and returned only the seal. The Senate never issued another. In one district, the walls of the civic archive were covered in chalk, not by decree, by instinct. People began writing names of those they remembered, the names they hoped they'd remember, the names they made up. Eventually, the chalk was washed away by rain. No one rewrote them. In the absence of structure, some created their own. A family reclassified themselves by seasons. Eldest was autumn, youngest spring. They did not speak old names again. A child went mute and pointed only to colors. A guard in the southern barracks assigned serial numbers to his household. When asked if it helped, he said, "It gives the silence edges." No new maps were printed, no official routes redrawn. One cartographer reportedly stood before an unfinished map for 3 days without moving. When someone finally checked on him, he had drawn only a single line across the center labeled, "Here there are no names." Tests were introduced as triage. Not for leadership, not yet, just to determine who could still count, recall, process. They began in medical wards, then spread to public squares, short forms, logic puzzles, image recall, pattern completion. Each was called a mirror. Each was said to reflect function, not value. At first, the results were private. Then they were coded into tokens. The tokens were color-coded. By the 5th week, people wore their scores openly, not by force, but because the ones who passed were moved indoors. The ones who failed were moved elsewhere. No one knew where elsewhere was, only that they didn't come back. At first, there were whispers of convalescence, then work camps, then burials, then eventually no talk at all. Children were tested next. The youngest were handed colored blocks and asked to sort them. The oldest were told to recite historical axioms in reverse. When one child refused to speak, the proctor marked the result in black ink, on sound. The child was taken before dusk. A pamphlet appeared across the city the next day, folded into bread loaves, tucked into drain pipes, painted on walls. It read, "To survive is to adapt is to rank. The 12 do not lead, they remain." The 12 had not yet spoken publicly, but their names circulated. Not names exactly, designations. 12 letters, 12 seals, each associated with a color, a tone, a function. 1. Red, defense. 2. Gold, coordination. 3. Blue, archive. And on through to 12. No faces were seen, no voices recorded, but messengers began to arrive from nowhere, bearing orders that required no enforcement. Compliance became reflex. Civic instructors began changing curricula, not by law, but by intuition. Children were sorted by score, not age. Those above threshold read new scripts. Those below were taught silence. One girl asked to be retested. She passed. She was not moved. When asked why, the proctor replied, "Movement is for those who have been noticed." Graffiti changed too. Gone were the spirals, the names, the pleas. In their place, numbers, ladders, mirrors. And once, on the gate of a gutted archive, what you see is what remains. The proclamation was carved in slate and set in every public square, not issued by the Senate, not signed, not spoken aloud, but it was read, and no one disputed it. The Ilurians survived too well. Their silence shielded them. Their rights unmoored us. What they withheld, we paid in flesh. In the southern quarter, guards removed all Ilurian symbols, even those long naturalized, amphora shapes, color motifs, rhythm banners. In one school, a teacher hesitated to discard an Ilurian folktale from the civic syllabus. The next day, she was resigned. The next week, her school was closed. The inscription above its gate read, "Clean words, clean minds." Scribes were ordered to purge archives of all non-licensed material. A list of banned Ilurian terms was circulated. No translations were offered. One scribe refused. She sealed herself in the west tower of the archive and copied a book by hand onto the walls. By the time guards entered, the book was gone. Only the walls remained, every surface covered in ink. The building was walled shut. No one was punished. No one was praised. At a civic well, a girl dropped a necklace engraved with an Ilurian glyph. A clerk fished it out and melted it. The girl's name was not recorded. The clerk was given a silver token. No one said what it meant, but he stopped waiting in line. The 12 did not issue laws, but the city shifted. Marketplace stalls, once stocked with Ilurian goods, were quietly shuttered. Temples that bore shared architectural motifs were realigned. A stone walkway was relaid not for repair, but to remove a geometric pattern that resembled an Ilurian motif. When asked why, a worker replied, "If we step over it, we remember it. If we remove it, we never did." The fever no longer spread, but fear did. And fear was easier to file. There was no ceremony, no banners, no horns, no gathered assembly, no words etched in law, but the 12 became sovereign anyway. It began with the marks, 12 silver tokens, worn not on chains but on pins, small, circular, engraved with a number, 1 through 12. They were first seen on messengers, then advisors, then instructors, then everywhere. Each person who wore one spoke calmly, moved efficiently, and was obeyed without instruction. No decree was issued, but the Republic was renamed suspended. The Senate Hall remained closed. Its steps grew moss. The Chancellor's pedestal was struck blank, not shattered, not replaced, just polished smooth. Children stopped learning the old anthem. They recited orderings instead. One classroom chant went, 1 to watch, 2 to weigh, 3 to seal, 4 to say, 5 to shape, 6 to hold, 7 to trace, 8 to fold, 9 to signal, 10 to clear, 11 to steady, 12 to hear. No one explained what the verses meant, but they were never forgotten. In the civic squares, the spiral murals were painted over, not vandalized, replaced. In their place, ladder forms, mirrored towers, and the sigils of the 12. No faces, no names, only number and shape. A stone bench bore a new inscription. The voice of many bends. The weight of 12 holds. There was no outcry, no protest, no final defense of the old republic. There was only compliance. Some say it was peace, others called it sedation, most called it necessary. At dawn, a merchant bowed to a figure wearing the mark of the 12. He had never seen her before. He had not been told to bow. He did not regret it. The fever did not return, but it left a vacancy, a silence, and the 12 filled it, not with fire, but with order. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6, The Weight of 12 Voices. The word king was never spoken, neither was empire. The 12 issued no proclamations, they made no speeches, they did not wear crowns, but the streets changed anyway. The Senate Road became Route 01. The form of memory was reflagged as Block 5-A. Children no longer attended the School of Civic Arts. They reported to alignment units. Each change was logged in dry ink, stamped by clerks, never explained. One clerk, when asked why the names were changing, simply said they weren't aligned. The 12 never signed their edicts. Instead, each message bore a seal, a shape, not a word. 1, a downward pointing triangle. 2, a single concentric ring. 3, a closed eye, and so on. Citizens learned to recognize them, not through instruction, but through repetition. When a door bore the mark of 8, no one entered. When a scroll bore the glyph of 3, no one argued. Instructors were forbidden from speaking certain terms. Republic, vote, oppose. None of these were outlawed, just removed from their curriculum. When students asked about them, the instructors responded, "They are not relevant to your fit." One girl asked what the town was called. Her teacher looked up from a ledger and said, "It's called Now." She never asked again. On the outer edges of the capital, where the old archives had once stood, a new district had formed. All right angles, mirrored walls, and walkways without names. No shops, no doors, only numbers etched in repeating columns. A man wandered through it once, tracing the numbers with his hand. He reached the far wall and wrote his name. By morning, it had been replaced with a clean sheet of glass. A child whispered her brother's name into a reflecting pool. The water held it, then stilled, then cooled. Then she returned the next day. The pool had been drained completely, and she was assigned a new block. Maps were reissued. The sea was no longer labeled. The inland forests had no marks. Only one direction remained, the center. In one plaza, an old statue remained, a woman with her arm raised in open welcome. No one defaced it, no one guarded it, but the path around it was rerouted. Children learned to walk the long way. Eventually they forgot why. There was no rebellion, no speeches from rooftops, no manifestos. There was only the sound of smooth paper replacing stone. The names they didn't use. No announcement preceded it, but one by one the people were moved. A man woke to find a brass tab affixed to his doorframe. V-C2. And the next morning, his workplace access token had failed to have been affirmed valid by the guard. He was redirected to a civic hall marked by a green stripe and a number. The clerk at the intake station reviewed his file and said, "You have been reclassified." Children were no longer grouped by age. They were assigned according to cadence, pattern retention, and response time. Each wore a colored pin marked with a small geometric icon. Each classroom operated by cue. When the instructor raised a coded marker, those matching the sequence stood. Those who failed to respond were routed to correction intervals, monitored sessions in detached chambers. A boy asked what the session was for. The instructor replied, for pattern recovery. Households were reassigned, not by request, but by flow rating. Families who moved inconsistently were separated. Siblings were sorted. Pets were not included in the updated census schema. One mother protested when her mother was relocated across the district. A runner delivered her an updated household listing. The girl's name had been removed. Bakery lines were restructured. Queue access was tied to classification bands. Those with higher ratings were served at prioritized lanes. Those below threshold received compressed flour rations marked with civic numerals. No one explained the numbers. They were not questioned. Evaluation centers became permanent installations. Once clinic adjacent, now standardized within every district. Attendance was scheduled, metrics were reviewed, assignments were updated. Some ascended in clearance, some remained static, or a few received no further instruction. An older man was called for retesting. He declined to participate. When asked to complete the coordination sequence, he said, "I do not fit into rows." The proctor recorded his response as non-aligned. He was escorted to reassignment. By evening, his residence had been reissued. The mirrors were now standard in all entryways, rectangular, matted black, and coded to respond. Mirrors were now standard in all entryways, rectangular, matte black. When approached, they did just as any mirror would. Households were marked. Mirrors were now standard in all entryways. No punishments were shown. No trials were held. The system operated cleanly. The streets grew quieter, and the pace of the city accelerated. The Empire did not speak in sentences, it spoke in glyphs. Each directive arrived as a single mark, etched in slate, dyed with civic ink, placed where needed. Red triangle above a bakery, ration shift. Blue circle in the bathhouse, cleansing order revision. White square on a household door, Entry suspended. There were no instructions, only the mark, only compliance. People no longer asked what the signs meant. They only noted what happened after. In a way, the glyphs stopped appearing on slate. They hovered, suspended just above buildings and pathways, shimmering faintly, anchored to no post or wall. They didn't flicker, they didn't move. They were simply there. And the city moved around them. Every home received a mirror. It was to be placed facing the threshold. Its use was not explained. No warning, no resistance. In the former archive district, a new structure rose. Square, faceless, 3 stories tall. At its base were 12 embossed plates, each carved with the now familiar markings of the ruling class. At sunset, the plates caught the light and held it. On one evening only, a single voice was heard from the tower. The world is shaped by what enters and what is refused. No official addressed the event. The voice was not heard again. During a resource calibration on the outskirts of the capital, miners uncovered an ore seam that snapped their tools. Iron bent, brass shattered. The metal didn't ring, it stilled the sound. Initial reports noted a sudden coldness of air, an unexpected silence in nearby animals. Samples were moved to containment. The site was sealed. No public report was issued. The material was logged under the code name Effulum, a short form designation from its excavation record. It was light but stable, dull to the eye, and dense against impact. Its surface repelled enchantment. When placed near Ilurian-made tools, their carvings failed to glow. No formal discovery was declared, no wonder was recorded. The 12 ordered refinement trials. Standard furnaces failed, rushed heating caused shattering. Eventually, a slow forging method was developed, using low, consistent heat and incremental pressure under stabilized crucibles. Only certified fitters above the 4th mark were allowed to witness the final stages. Their names weren't published. The first usable object was a small blade, slightly longer than a man's hand, flat, gripless, undecorated. It was placed under crystal in a plaza near the Hall of Scores. Its label read, Correction Tool, Form 1. Rumors circulated that Effulum nullified dream or quieted thoughts, that it bent light or slowed time. No confirmations were issued. The Bureau of Civic Discipline said only the tool functions as intended. Ilurian objects proved fragile in its presence. Scrolls blackened, wards broke, memory-anchored stones cracked at edges. None of these outcomes were formally tested. None were denied either. Effulum was not rare, but it was precise. It could not be overused. It could not be overused. When stressed repeatedly, it showed fine fractures and eventually broke long pattern lines. These failures were logged. Fitters adjusted accordingly. 3 new workhouses were constructed beyond the capital walls. No markings, no announcements, only function. Workers wore no colors. Their shift records were counted in silence. Each object was recorded by shape, weight, and glyph alignment. The Empire did not announce its weapon, it cataloged it. And when soldiers walked with Effulum at their sides, strapped in quiet sheaths, cold across their backs, in the tips of their spears, no cheers rose, only the sound of boots on clean stone. Iluria was not named, it was indexed. Public slates in every form displayed a new designation. Civic Zone, Brigham South, Category 2. Status. Unaligned. No map referenced Iluria. No citizen spoke the name aloud. Children who were corrected without elaboration. Who asked were corrected without elaboration. Archived material from the colonial imperial registry were marked for temporal reclassification. Not destroyed, just removed from sequence. A junior scribe flagged one document as missing. It had not been checked out. It had not been misfiled. It had been dissolved. One cartographic chart showed the region shaded in gray. No roads, no capitals, no rivers, just a quadrant mark and the inscription, pending integration. In schools, a new practice began. Each term, students were assigned a list of pre-Empire turns. They read them aloud. They burned one. When asked why, the instructor replied, because that memory is a waste. The murals changed too. In the central hall of the alignment office, a new design was unveiled. 12 lines descending from a shared point, each touching an irregular grid of gray blocks. None of the blocks bore names, only numbers. Beneath the mural, a plate read, order projects outward, the rest follows. Deployment rosters were issued without event. They were folded into standard announcements stamped with glyphs of civic correction. There was no parade, no drums, only movement. Those selected for southbound transfer received new tools, mostly standard, some modified. Effulum armatures, Effulum blades, Effulum plating layered beneath standard harnesses. The distribution report read, for expected ambient instability. One girl watched her brother read his order, fold it once, and place it in his coat. He did not speak. He did not return the next morning. She was reassigned to a different household by the end of the week. No term like war appeared just yet. No map labeled the zone hostile. Iluria was not labeled as just an enemy, but rather as incomplete. The 12 issued one final notation in the season's last bulletin. South Rigum requires harmonization. Correction is continuous. No justification followed. No objection was recorded. Only the ships moved. No declaration was made. No bells were rung. But the machinery began to move. Supply convoys shifted routes. Marked crates moved eastward, sealed in reinforced shells, tagged with weight and tier markings. Most bore the symbol for calibration external. A few had no label at all, only a number etched deep. One child tapped the metal of a passing crate. It was colder than expected. She kept walking. Marching units assembled at dawn intervals, not with drums, not with chants, just footsteps. Uniform, unsounded, consistent. They wore standard configuration, underlaid with Effulum plating. No insignia, no division markers, only numerical tags and reflective panels built into the collar seams. A girl watched them pass. She did not count aloud, but she kept track with her fingers. When she reached 12, she stopped. The harbor grew dense. No names on the ships, no flags, just long holes and loaded holds. Dock workers moved with posted manifest slates, following symbol-coded instructions. Voices were minimized, gestures were preferred. A sign beside the loading ramp of pulleys read, Class, corrective. Function, external. Clearance, continuous. No curfew was declared, yet the city fell quiet. No one asked why the streets cleared. No one waited for permission. They simply did not stand in the way. In the civic square, a stand was installed, angular, glass-paneled, unstaffed. When approached, one could see visual bands corresponding with civic alignment. Green, amber, or gray. Most were green labeled, the people that is, and looked at the parchment beneath the green band, matching their green labeling. Some were gray labeled, and looked at the parchment beneath the gray. Those who saw their names and orders on the parchment beneath the gray label received a sealed envelope within 2 days. The envelope read, adjustment required, External realignment protocol. Report by dusk. A man returned to the stand after receiving nothing. He stood in front of it for several minutes, but noticed there was a black label, and underneath it was a parchment upon which his name was written. That evening, a relocation unit visited his building. By morning, his unit was occupied by someone else. There was no cheering, no protest, no recorded speeches, only the creak of dock timbers, the rhythm of bootfall, and the low hush of ships slipping into the channel. When the first vessel departed, no horn sounded, only wind and paper pinned to a post near the waterline shifted in the breeze. It bore the mark of the 12, and the line, "Correction proceeds." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Mirror That Cracked. The children stood barefoot in ordered rows. The floor beneath them was inked with arcs and circles, numbered grids, and balanced lines. It was called the weighing room, though no scales hung from its rafters. Here, weight was measured not by mass, but by the strain one's body could bear, the silence one could hold, the precision with which one moved. The stone doors closed behind them without sound. At a signal, a single clap of carved wood, the drill began. They were made to lift smooth stone blocks one at a time, each marked with a brass ring. Not all blocks weighed the same. The children did not know which was which. They were timed, watched, logged. Those who lifted too slowly were marked amber. Those who dropped their block were escorted out. One boy, broad-backed, quiet-eyed, lifted a weight marked 4 in both hands, then again with 1, then once more without prompting. The observers whispered. One inscribed a double mark beside his tag. His name was not called, but when the blocks were cleared, he was told to remain standing. He didn't speak. He waited. He was later sent through a side door, not marked, not explained. Those doors led forward. At the opposite end of the hall, a thinner boy, pale, sharp-jointed, moved with precision, not fast, not slow, but exact. Each placement of his foot hit the arc. Each movement was clean, uncorrected. But as he waited for the next command, he knelt, pressed a fingertip into the dust. He traced a curve, then another. By the time the observers noticed, he had made the shape whole, a spiral, perfect and small. No words were spoken. An overseer marked his ledger. Another retrieved the boy's brass tag. He was escorted out through the rear. His name was not called again. After the cycle ended, one of the instructors walked the length of the room. He inspected the floor, paused at the spiral, then he erased it with one firm press of his boot. The official board was updated that evening. Of the original 37 were promoted. 4 were reassigned to foundation labor. 19 were carried forward to secondary testing. 2 names were not recorded at all. The classroom was narrow, quiet, and arranged in tiers. Each student sat at a slate stone desk, stylus ready, scroll template unfolded to the left. The instructor stood behind a single bell. When it chimed, the copying began. The glyph sequence was standard, a 2-row civic array drawn from the founding forms. Alignment, order, replication, silence. Each symbol had to be written from memory. Not perfectly, just within tolerance. No flares, no inversions, no annotations. The first student finished early. Her hand was steady, her rows even. She placed her stylus down before the second bell and waited, eyes forward. When the instructor inspected her sheet, he made a short double stroke on her roster slip. Her scroll was collected in silence. Before the end of the period, she was tapped on the shoulder and handed a slip marked acceleration, tier movement approved. She bowed. She left the room. 2 seats behind her, another student worked slower. Her glyphs were clear, but when she reached the final row, she hesitated, then added something. It was a small loop, a nested line inside the final glyph. Elegant, precise, decorative, unnecessary. She sealed her scroll and passed it forward. The instructor paused when he reached hers. He stared longer than usual, then tapped once, slowly, and made a note on his slip. He wrote, not a line flourish, aesthetic deviation. After this session, that student received no mark of failure, no punishment. She was not reassigned. She simply did not return to class the next day. No withdrawal was recorded. Her desk was filled by another child by the end of the week. That evening, in the outer hall, a training observer spoke to the instructor. "Why remove her? The form was strong." The instructor replied, "It was too strong, but not for us. The 12 could use that kind of strength." It began with silence, not the normal silence of training, which was drilled and expected, but a deeper pause that entered the room without announcement. The top ranks, those in the upper third of scoring across strength, memory, and compliance, were pulled from their regular exercises and given a new drill cycle. It was not harder, it was cleaner. No instructor spoke, no instructions were posted. A bell rang, the drill began. A bell rang, the drill ended. After 3 cycles, the observers changed. There were no robes, no civic badges, only plain garments with narrow seams and Effulum bracers gleaming dully at the wrist. They stood at the edges of the courts and did not speak. They wrote nothing visible. They watched everything. One boy, quick in reaction drills, near perfect in your recitation, was asked to repeat a form 3 times. He did so, faster each time. When he finished, one of the watchers stepped forward. The boy bowed. The man gestured toward the outer corridor. No words were exchanged. The boy followed. He did not return that week. His name was struck through on the roster. 2 weeks later, it appeared with a new classification. External enforcement admitted. Students did not ask who the watchers were, but they noticed that only the highest were taken, and not all of them. Only those who finished drills with clean breath and blank faces. Only those who saluted without sound. Only those who never looked confused. The verbal analysis chamber was windowless, octagonal, and lined with thick cloth to absorb echo. A single candle burned at the center of the table. Its flicker was steady. Each student was brought in alone. The girl who entered first was the best in her class. By all measures, she completed logic strings in fewer than 6 moves. Her verbal recall was perfect. She corrected an evaluator's phrasing once. She was not punished, she was promoted. But in her final session, she paused. The prompt was simple. Name the 5 civic duties in order of precedence. She answered without delay, then asked, why were they chosen in that order? The proctor wrote nothing, but after the test, she was handed a slate bearing a gray stamp. It read, Form D7, silence authorization, voluntary. She brought it home that evening. She read it 3 times. It was not a punishment. It was not a correction. It offered her a path forward, clearer, faster, more efficient. She signed. When she returned to class, she wore a silver thread looped around her collar. It signified a speaker's withdrawal. She continued to perform in the highest percentile. She was moved into upper-tier reasoning without further incident. Another student, her peer, equal score but not in temperament, was given the same form a week later. He did not sign. He was not removed, but his ranking dropped from the public boards. His classroom was changed. His file no longer appeared on shared rosters. One day, his slate was missing from the shelf. Another student took his seat. No notice was issued. The girl that had succeeded hardly ever spoke, not out of fear, out of clarity. Her eyes tracked each glyph with perfection. Her name remained at the top of every list. He had recorded no faults, every metric perfect. Balanced drills, silent posture, memory recall, tier 1 across the board. His reading cadence was used to calibrate the new standard. He never failed to report. He never asked a question. One final day of his progression cycle, he was pulled from the others and brought to a smaller hall, stone-tiled, burnished, sealed from sound. 2 proctors watched as he was presented with his assignment slate. It bore no surprises. His name at the top. His clearance already set. The line below read, Directive, Instructional Command, Civic Alignment Division. He bowed once. The proctors did not speak. He was dismissed. He returned to his chamber that evening. It had been cleaned in preparation. A small trunk awaited. clothing, writing implements, an Effulum ring to be worn on formal occasions. He did not unpack. He sat at the edge of his bed for several minutes, then stood, then crouched beside the bunk's wooden leg. With the tip of a nail, he scratched a perfect circle into the wooden grain. Not large, not deep, but exact. No one saw him do it. The next morning, he stood in uniform. On time, without deviation, he gave no indication of unrest. The bunk was inspected during his relocation. The mark was noted but not commented on. A junior attendant sanded it down. Later that week, a similar mark appeared again, in a different chamber on a different bunk. His scores remained untouched, his performance exemplary. But once, only once, he was seen by a night clerk in the hall of evaluation. He had paused before a polished bronze wall plate, not functional, not instructional. It held no test glyphs, only reflection. He stood before it longer than necessary, said nothing, did nothing, then walked away. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Armor That Shattered. The summons came as lists, no announcements, no ceremonies, just a sequence of brass-etched plates nailed to the civic boards in every square of Priimydia. Each plate bore unit designation, classification, code, sequence, number, tier, alignment, rank. No names at the top, alignment call, martial scale, correction. The war was not named, it did not need one. The conscription squares filled in silence. Boys of 16, 17, each stood in line, token in hand, tunic pressed, posture square. Those with green-rimmed civic pins were expected. Those with silver seals were already gone. Those marked amber remained in support corps. Eyes low, back straight. At intake, no questions were permitted. Each conscript was stripped of civic tokens and issued Effulum chainmail, cooled in ash before handling, Effulum full-plate armor, fitted in silence, Effulum shield, round face, spine backed, rectangular though. Effulum shield, rectangular faced, spine backed. Effulum spear, banded in grip, single-edged tip. All armor was identical. All straps fit the same place on every shoulder. There were no crests, no family marks, only rank engraved into the left gauntlet. By midday, the squares echoed with the sound of synchronized movement. Not shouting, just steel on stone, footstep by footstep. Formation drills began the moment the final piece was buckled. No instruction, only rhythm. Each unit marched once in full circuit, then twice again in staggered reverse. Those who faltered were removed, not punishment, reassigned. In the harbors, the ships waited. Steel hull, triple-decked, sail rigged with rotating cannon lines. Each vessel bore the name of a mountain. Each prow was etched with silent geometry, the same symbol repeated, a perfect triangle nested in a square. These were not the fishing vessels of the old republic, nor the coastal caravels of the memory keepers. These were war machines, the kind that could not be mistaken for anything else. The Ilurians would still be using oared triremes, painted wood, curved prows, rope that snapped under rain. None of it would matter. The fleet of Priimydia, iron-skinned, wind-cut, flame-fitted, would reach Rigum before the Ilurians understood the correction had already begun. Each family with a conscript was issued a linen banner. Stitched in civic block, fitted, armed, ready. No medals were promised, no memorials proposed, only alignment. That night, the fitted slept in dormitories layered by region. No one spoke. There was no need. Each soldier had been given a slate with one word engraved on it, aligned. No declaration, no oath, just the recognition. You are no longer an individual. You are the line. They moved in columns 4 across. Effulum gleamed like scorched silver beneath the overcast sky. No standards were carried, but no drums were beaten. Only the weight of motion. Uniform unbroken. From the high ridges above the causeways, the lines looked endless. The Guild of Righteousness led the vanguard. Their armor was not distinct, but their silence was heavier. They gave no orders. They walked slightly ahead of the line. When they stopped, others stopped. Their presence meant priority. By the 6th day, the first Ilurian sentries were spotted along the ridge borders. None engaged, none stood their ground. The Priimydians advanced without pause. In a valley carved by pre-wall, in a nearby valley, the first skirmish broke open. Ilurian defenders wore loose iron mail and bore short, curved blades. They fought with elemental blasts, flame strikes, hardened gusts, columns of sand. The Priimydians did not stagger. The Effulum shields absorbed the impacts. The line narrowed, then opened, then closed around them. 18 Ilurians fell before the first Priimydian injury was recorded. A dislocated shoulder during a thrust sequence. No death was noted on the Imperial side. The battle ended in 9 minutes. The field was cleared by nightfall. Nothing remained but slag and blackened brush and bodies. By the time the Priimydians reached the outer roads of Rigum, 7 more villages had been passed. None resisted. Some were empty before arrival. Others stood in rows, heads bowed, no weapons in sight. No orders were given to burn, but fires followed anyway, set by quartermasters to sterilize the ground. Contagion was the official term. Control was the purpose. The roads into Rigum were paved by feet and ash. The war was not a contest. It was a process, and the machine moved perfectly. It happened on the 12th day. A forward phalanx was holding a bridge, crossing under erratic fire. Gusts and lances of arching flame launched from a ridge of Ilurian stoneworkers turned defenders. The Priimydians advanced without pause, without even flinching. Formation didn't break. The shields held, and then only one didn't. The shield belonged to a guild regular, 3rd rank. His file was clean, his alignment was faultless. He had already absorbed over 30 magical impacts that day, each absorbed without visible strain. His stance never broke, his timing was exact. Then the 31st. Not brighter, not louder, just once more, and the shield burst. It didn't crack, it didn't dent, it exploded, out and forward, in a bloom of glass-fine shards that sliced into the nearby environment before embedding into stonework. The guild soldier stood for a moment, then collapsed. He got up. He was fine. But field engineers retrieved the fragments. Every bit. Still intact at the microscopic lattice, but overloaded. The engineers wouldn't know that. They didn't have the tools. But later tests would show stress fractures invisible to the naked eye. Not damage from force, but from saturation. Magic did not weaken Effulum. It filled it. Too much, and it changed. From pliant to brittle. From shield to shrapnel. The engineers were ordered to log the failure as field pressure collapse. No mention of magic saturation, no correlation analysis. A private note was etched into one restricted ledger. Material holds until it doesn't. Threshold unknown. Recommend rotational usage. The note was never formally approved. The shield template was not revised. The war moved on, and the metal kept glowing quietly, more than before. The village had no name, not on the new maps. The older maps, though this still printed on parchment, still stored in the Academy vaults, called it Vela, a northern agricultural province known for river grain and glasswork. Population 3,812. The orders were precise: surround, separate, reclassify. Anyone unable to produce documentation of alignment was removed. Those whose dialects differed from the updated standard were marked for review. Those who hesitated even briefly were silenced before the hesitation completed. The GOR, the Guild of Righteousness, moved like clean stone, smooth, weightless, unhurried, each step performed by the manual, each mark logged in slate. To them, it was not a massacre. It was an audit. By dusk, the center of the village was clear. By midnight, so were the outer lanes. No fires were started, no records were burned. They were simply edited. The following morning, a field commander reported a discrepancy. Initial estimates suggested a local population of 4,000. Adjusted tally post-correction, 2,988. Another officer stared at the ledger, then spoke. That's 1,000 dead. The commander shook his head. Not dead, just no longer present. Later that week, the region's maps were revised. Where once it said Vela, it now read only aligned. No mention of a village, no mention of loss, just correction, complete and total. The number that remained, 824, was never publicly confirmed, but circulated among engineers, among clerks. It became a whisper, not of horror, but of scale, the number that should not be. So ends chapter 8. So ends book 4. End of recording.